Today, we are going to tackle an absolutely pivotal half-century in American history. We're talking about the period from 1898 to 1945, when the United States basically remade itself from the ground up, going from a nation that mostly kept to itself to a global superpower, all while wrestling with some massive changes at home.
So that brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. How on earth did all of that happen in just a few decades? This journey wasn't some straight line of progress. No, it was a messy, fascinating story full of intense debate, radical reforms, and some really deep cultural battles.
All right, so to really get our heads around this transformation, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at America at a crossroads right at the turn of the century. Then, we'll dive into its new imperial ambitions. After that, we'll see the wave of reforms happening back home. Check out how World War I put the country to the test. And finally, we'll explore the crazy cultural clashes of the Roaring Twenties. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the 1890s. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner makes this huge announcement. He declares that the American frontier, that endless western land that had shaped the American spirit for a century, is now officially closed. This actually created a kind of national anxiety. If America couldn't expand west anymore, where was all that energy supposed to go? For a lot of influential people, the answer was pretty clear. We've got to look outward.
And that impulse to look outward, well, it led directly into what we call America's Age of Empire. This was the moment the U.S. stepped onto the world stage in a huge, dramatic new way. But let me tell you, it was a decision that split the country right down the middle.
So when we use this word imperialism, what are we really talking about? Well, at its core, it's just about building an empire. One country extending its power and influence over other countries and people. The European powers had been playing this game for centuries, and now a lot of Americans were starting to feel like it was their turn to get in on the action.
And boy, was the country divided. On one side, you had the imperialists. They were arguing that American factories needed new markets, that we needed a powerful navy to protect our interests, and some even argued it was a Christian duty to civilize other parts of the world. But on the other side, the anti-imperialists fired back that building an empire went against the core American value of self-determination. They brought up George Washington's old warning about getting tangled up in foreign problems and asked this really crucial question: does the Constitution follow the flag? In other words, do people in our new territories get the same rights as American citizens? Now, this wasn't just some academic debate. It exploded into reality with the Spanish-American War in 1898. When the U.S. battleship Maine blew up in Cuba, sensational newspapers, what they called yellow journalism, immediately blamed Spain and whipped the public into a frenzy. Before you knew it, America was at war. And the war itself? It was over almost as soon as it started. And the result was staggering. The U.S. basically got an empire overnight. It seized the Philippines, which immediately sparked a brutal and bloody war against Filipino nationalists, and it also took Guam and Puerto Rico. On top of that, it annexed Hawaii and forced Cuba into an agreement that gave the U.S. total control over its affairs. Suddenly, and officially, America was an imperial power. But here's the fascinating part. While America was flexing its muscles abroad, a totally different kind of revolution was happening back home. The previous era, the Gilded Age, had created incredible wealth, but it also led to unbelievable poverty, corruption, and horrible working conditions. And a new movement, the Progressives, set out to fix it all, using the power of the government itself. And leading the charge were these incredible investigative journalists. Teddy Roosevelt actually gave them their famous nickname, the Muckrakers. Their whole idea was simple but powerful. If you could just expose the filth and corruption, the muck, that was hiding just beneath the surface of society, the American people would be outraged and demand change. And they were right. Take Upton Sinclair. His novel, The Jungle, described the Chicago meatpacking industry in such graphic, disgusting detail that it horrified the entire country. The public outcry was so massive that it led directly to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, our first real consumer protection laws. Then you had Ida Tarbell. She wrote an absolutely devastating takedown of John D. Rockefeller's giant monopoly, Standard Oil. Her meticulous reporting gave the government all the ammunition it needed to start trust-busting, breaking up these massive corporations that were choking out all competition. And Jacob Riis, he used a powerful new tool, photography.
His book, How the Other Half Lives, showed wealthy and middle-class Americans the shocking reality of life in the city's slums. You couldn't ignore those images. They directly spurred the first major push for housing and sanitation reform. Now, the progressives didn't just want to expose problems, they wanted to fundamentally change the political system. They fought to give more power directly to the people through things like the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. But their biggest victory, that had to be the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of senators, taking that power away from corrupt politicians and putting it right in the hands of the voters.
So you have these two massive forces at work, a newly powerful federal government at home and a new, assertive role on the world stage. Well, in World War I, those two things collided. The war would become a massive test for America, and it would end up expanding the power of the government in ways no one had ever imagined. You know, America really tried to stay neutral, but Germany kept pushing the limits. First, the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania outraged the public. Then Germany went back on its promises and started sinking any ship it wanted to. But the final straw, that was the Zimmermann telegram. It was a secret message from Germany to Mexico, offering to help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they attacked the U.S. Once that got out, it was over. President Wilson went to Congress and declared war, famously saying it was to make the world safe for democracy. And to fight this total war, the government took over the home front like never before. The War Industries Board was telling factories what to build. The Food Administration was managing what people ate. But, and this is a really big but, this mobilization came at a steep price for civil liberties. The Espionage and Sedition Acts basically made it a crime to speak out against the war. And the Supreme Court even backed this up, saying that speech that creates a clear and present danger isn't protected. So, the war ends. America emerges as a confident global power. But all those huge changes from the last few decades, they created some serious cracks in the foundation of American society. And the 1920s became this decade-long culture war, a massive clash between the past and the future. And if you want to understand the Roaring Twenties, you just have to know this one statistic. By 1920, for the very first time, more Americans lived in cities than in the countryside. That single demographic shift is the engine behind pretty much all of the conflicts of the decade. You basically had two Americas emerge. In the cities, you had the modernists. They embraced change, new science like evolution, and new rules for women. But out in rural America, you had the fundamentalists. They saw all this as moral decay, they held to a literal reading of the Bible, and they fought to defend traditional values. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. It was a battle for the very soul of the country. And this whole battle just erupted onto the national stage during the famous Scopes monkey trial over teaching evolution in schools. In a legendary courtroom moment, the brilliant defense lawyer Clarence Darrow backed the prosecution's star witness into a corner, who finally declared, "I do not think about things that I do not think about." That one line perfectly captured the deep divide between modern skepticism and unwavering traditional belief that had the whole nation glued to their radios. The whole decade was just this whirlwind of contradictions. You had the flapper becoming a symbol of liberated women. You had the Harlem Renaissance, this incredible explosion of Black art and culture. But at the exact same time, you had this dark wave of anti-immigrant fear called the Red Scare, leading to raids on suspected radicals. And of course, you had Prohibition, the ban on alcohol, which backfired completely and gave rise to organized crime. And you can see that anti-immigrant feeling written directly into law. Just look at this chart. A series of quota acts in the early 20s basically slammed the door shut on immigration, especially for people from Southern and Eastern Europe. After a period of expanding all over the globe, America was suddenly turning inward, scared of the varied changes that were making it modern. So there you have it. In just a couple of decades, America completely reinvented itself. It became a global power through war, it transformed its society through reform, and it became a modern urban nation that was deeply, deeply divided by the sheer speed of that change. And all of that leaves us with one final, huge question. What was the true price of becoming modern America?